It was June 14th, 1983, and Thomas Carlyle was 47 years old when he stood in the equipment lot at Hendricks, New Holland, just outside Watertown, South Dakota, and made the decision that would keep his farm alive for 22 years and kill him in the end. He didn't know that second part yet. What he knew was this: the dairy was failing, milk prices had been falling for 3 straight years, and the bank had made it clear that his operating line of credit would not be renewed unless something changed. He had 4 sons, 3 of them still in school, and a wife who hadn't bought herself a new coat in 6 years. He had 280 acres, 64 head of Holstein, and a mortgage that predated his marriage. And he had a choice to make. The dealer, a man named Vernon Oakes, had walked him through the modern milking parlor setup twice already. Stainless steel, automated feeders, a bulk tank that could handle twice his current volume. It was the future, Vernon said. Everyone was moving that direction. The cost was $48,000 financed over 7 years at 11.5% interest. Thomas had asked what it would cost to keep doing what he was doing. Vernon hadn't answered right away. He'd looked out across the lot toward the hay equipment, and then he'd said, "You can't keep doing what you're doing." Thomas knew that was true, but he also knew that $48,000 was more money than his father had ever borrowed in his life. His father had died in 1971 on a farm with no debt, and Thomas had always believed that mattered, that it meant something, that a man who owned his land outright was a different kind of man than one who owed a bank. So he'd walked away from the milking parlor and gone to look at the hay equipment instead. The New Holland 855 round baler sat in the back corner of the lot, dark blue and heavy, still hitched to a demonstration tractor. It was used, 4 years old, with 9,000 bales on the meter. The paint was chipped along the pickup teeth. One hydraulic line had been replaced. Vernon said it had come off a farm in Minnesota where the man had bought a newer model. Thomas asked how much. Vernon said $7,200. Thomas asked what a man could make baling custom work. Vernon said that depended on the man. Thomas stood there for a long time looking at the baler, and then he said he'd take it. He'd finance it over 3 years. He'd pay cash for a used rake and a used tedder, and he'd do custom baling for every farmer in the county who still put up small square bales and wanted to switch to rounds. He wouldn't modernize the dairy. He'd keep the milking equipment he had, keep the herd size where it was, and make the difference on contract work. Vernon had nodded slowly, and then he'd said, "You're going to work yourself to death, Thomas." Thomas had signed the papers anyway. He'd grown up on that farm, the youngest of 3 boys, and by the time he was 12, both his older brothers had made it clear they weren't staying. One went to Sioux Falls and got a job at John Morrell. The other joined the Army and never came back to South Dakota at all. That left Thomas, and his father never asked if he wanted the farm. He just assumed. Thomas had never minded that. He liked the work, he liked the cattle, liked the rhythm of the day, liked the fact that the farm didn't change much from year to year. His father ran 50 head of dairy cows and put up hay on the rest of the acreage, and Thomas had expected to do the same. But his father had farmed in a different time. His father had never had to compete with operations milking 200 head, had never had to explain to a milk co-op why his butterfat content was inconsistent, had never spent a Tuesday afternoon sitting across from a loan officer who looked at a balance sheet and asked, in a voice that wasn't unkind, whether Thomas had considered selling. Thomas had considered it. He'd considered it the same way a man considers cutting off his own hand when it's caught in a machine. Technically possible. Not actually an option. The baler arrived on a Thursday. Thomas spent the first week learning how to run it, how to adjust the tension on the belts, how to keep the pickup teeth from clogging in heavy windrow. He practiced in his own fields first, baling hay he would have baled anyway, and by the end of the second week, he felt confident enough to take a job. The first contract came from a neighbor named Earl Havlicek, who ran 40 head of beef cattle and had always done his own baling with a small square baler that was older than Thomas. Earl's back had gone out that spring, and he couldn't lift bales anymore. He'd heard Thomas had a round baler and asked what he'd charge per bale. Thomas said $1.75. Earl said that was fair. Thomas baled 340 bales over 2 days, and Earl paid him in cash the following week. Thomas put the money in an envelope and paid down part of the baler loan early. That felt like progress. By the end of the first summer, he'd baled for 11 different farms. He worked mornings in the dairy, baled from noon until dark, and then came home and did the evening milking. His oldest son, Jacob, was 16 that year and helped with the cattle when Thomas was gone. His wife, Anne, kept the books and called customers and made sure Thomas ate something besides coffee and cold sandwiches. He made $4,100 from custom baling that first year, and it was just enough. Just enough to make the payment on the baler, just enough to keep the operating line current, just enough to tell himself he'd made the right choice. The problem with custom baling was that it didn't stop. A dairy had a schedule. You milked twice a day, every day, and the work was hard, but it was predictable. You knew when you'd start, and you knew when you'd finish, and in between, the cows didn't care if it was hot or cold or if your back hurt. Baling was different. Baling depended on the weather, and the weather didn't care about your schedule. If it rained, you waited. If the forecast called for rain in 3 days, you worked until the job was done, even if that meant 16-hour days and no sleep, and baling by headlights at 2 in the morning. Thomas learned to read the sky the way some men read the stock market. He learned which clouds meant rain in 6 hours and which meant rain in 2. He learned to feel the humidity change in his shoulders before the first drops fell. And he learned that the men who called him for custom work expected him to be available, because if he wasn't, they'd call someone else, and next year they wouldn't call him at all. So he worked. He worked through the summer of 1984 and the summer of 1985, and by the summer of 1986, he had enough steady customers that he raised his rate to $2 per bale. Some of them grumbled, but none of them left. He paid off the baler in 1986, 2 payments early. He bought a second rake in 1987. By 1988, he was baling more than 4,000 bales a season. The dairy stayed small, the herd stayed at 64 head, the milk check stayed flat. But the custom work grew, and Thomas told himself that was enough. His sons were growing up. Jacob graduated high school in 1985 and stayed on the farm. He ran the baler some days and he was good at it, careful with the equipment, steady with the customers. Thomas had started to think that maybe Jacob would take over one day, that the farm would continue. His second son, Michael, graduated in 1987 and left for college in Brookings. He studied accounting and came home for Christmas and told Thomas he'd gotten a job offer in Rapid City. Thomas had nodded and said that was good, that Michael should take it. He'd meant it. Not every son was supposed to farm. His third son, Paul, was still in high school in 1988, and his youngest, David, was in middle school. Anne asked Thomas once if he thought any of them would stay, and Thomas had said he didn't know. He said it wasn't the kind of thing you could make a boy do. Anne had nodded and hadn't asked again. In the summer of 1991, Thomas turned 55. He'd been custom baling for 8 years, and he was tired in a way that didn't go away with sleep. His knees hurt in the morning. His lower back seized up if he sat too long. He had a cough that started in April and didn't stop until October, and Anne had asked him twice to see a doctor. He hadn't gone. He told himself he didn't have time. That summer was dry. The hay came off light, and the bales were smaller than usual, and Thomas had to bale more acres to make the same number of bales. He worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and on Sundays, he worked in the dairy and tried to catch up on maintenance. Jacob was 22 that year, and he'd started talking about getting his own place. He'd been seeing a girl from Clear Lake, and they were talking about getting married, and Jacob had asked Thomas if he thought the farm could support 2 families. Thomas had said no, not the way it was set up. Not with the dairy still small and the custom work still one-man jobs. He'd told Jacob he should find his own way, same as Michael had, and Jacob had nodded and stopped asking. 2 months later, Jacob moved to Sioux Falls and got a job at a feed mill. Thomas hired a high school kid to help with the milking. The summer of 1995 was the worst in 20 years. It rained in June. It rained in July. The first cutting of hay rotted in the windrow, and Thomas lost half his contracts because the farmers couldn't get their fields dry enough to bale. The second cutting was late and thin, and by the time he got it baled, it was mid-August and the quality was poor. He made $1,800 that summer from custom work. The dairy lost money. The bank called in September and said they needed to restructure the operating line. The interest rate went up. The payment schedule got shorter. Thomas signed the new papers and drove home and didn't tell Anne how bad it was. He told himself it would be better next year. It wasn't. In 1996, milk prices dropped again. The co-op started penalizing farms with inconsistent production, and Thomas's herd was too small to smooth out the variation. Some months he got the full price. Some months he got 70 cents on the dollar. He thought about selling the cows. He thought about it the way a man thinks about selling his father's wedding ring. Possible, but wrong. Paul came home from college in the spring of 1998 with a degree in agricultural business and a job offer from a seed company in Iowa. He told Thomas he wasn't going to take it. He said he wanted to come back to the farm, wanted to help modernize, wanted to apply for grants and look into rotational grazing and maybe expand the custom work into silage baling. Thomas had listened, and then he'd said no. Paul had asked why. Thomas had said because there wasn't enough money in it. Because the farm couldn't support Paul and a family. Because Thomas had spent 15 years trying to make it work, and it was working, but only barely, and only because Thomas didn't take a salary, and Anne didn't ask for anything, and the house hadn't been painted since 1979. Paul had argued. He'd said that was exactly why the farm needed to change, that doing the same thing and expecting different results was insane. Thomas had said the same thing kept the lights on. Paul left for Iowa in June. Thomas bailed alone that summer. By the year 2000, Thomas was 64 years old, and the dairy was still running, and the custom baling was still bringing in just enough, and Thomas was still working every day from dawn until long after dark. Anne told him he needed to slow down. Thomas said he would, soon. He said it the same way he'd been saying it for 10 years. His youngest son, David, had moved to Minnesota and was working in IT. Jacob was managing the feed mill in Sioux Falls. Michael was a CPA in Rapid City. Paul was a regional sales manager for the seed company and doing well. None of them farmed. Thomas told himself that was fine, that he'd never expected them to, that farming wasn't something you forced on your children. But some nights, when he was too tired to sleep, he wondered if he'd done something wrong, if he'd worked so hard to save the farm that he'd made it impossible to want. The summer of 2003 was hot. The kind of hot where the air didn't move and the grass turned brown by the first week of July, and the cattle stood in the shade and didn't eat. Thomas had 12 contracts that year, and the hay was coming off dry and fast, and he was baling 7 days a week just to keep up. He was 67. He told Anne he'd hire help next year. She didn't believe him. On July 18th, he was baling a field for a farmer named Roger Dietrich, 20 miles south of the home place. It was 96 degrees, and Thomas had been running the baler since 6 that morning. He'd stopped once at noon to eat a sandwich and drink a bottle of water, and then he'd climbed back on the tractor and kept going. At 3:30 in the afternoon, he felt a tightness in his chest. He ignored it. At 4, the tightness got worse, and his left arm started to ache. He shut the tractor down and sat there for a minute, breathing slowly, telling himself it was the heat, that he just needed to rest. He climbed down from the tractor, walked 10 feet, and collapsed. Roger Dietrich's son found him an hour later, lying in the stubble next to the windrow. The baler was still attached to the tractor. The engine was off. Thomas was unconscious. The ambulance took him to Watertown, and the doctors said he'd had a heart attack, a significant one. They said he was lucky to be alive. They said he needed to rest, needed to reduce stress, needed to stop working 16-hour days in the heat. Thomas spent 4 days in the hospital. When he got home, he went back to work. Anne asked him why. He said because the work didn't stop just because he'd had a heart attack. Because Roger Dietrich still had 40 acres of hay in the field and no way to bale it. Because if Thomas didn't finish the job, Roger would find someone else, and next year Thomas would lose the contract. Anne said he was going to kill himself. Thomas said he'd be careful. He went back out the following Monday and finished Roger's field. His chest hurt and his arms still ached, and he had to stop 3 times to rest. But he finished the job. Roger paid him in cash and asked if Thomas was feeling all right. Thomas said he was fine. The next 2 years were slower. Thomas cut back to 10 contracts. He hired a neighbor kid to help with the tedding and raking, and he let the kid run the baler on the easier fields. He told himself he was easing into retirement, but he didn't retire. He couldn't. The dairy was still losing money, and the custom work was the only thing keeping the payments current. He'd thought about selling the cows 100 times, but the cows were what made it a farm. Without them, it was just a man with a baler, and that didn't feel like enough. In the summer of 2005, Thomas turned 69. He had 8 contracts that year, and the work felt manageable. He wasn't baling every day. He wasn't working until midnight. He was taking Sundays off, and he'd even talked to Anne about taking a weekend trip to the Black Hills in the fall. He told himself he was doing better. It was August 12, 2005, and Thomas was baling a field for a farmer named Carl Winters, 15 miles west of Watertown. It was a small job, maybe 150 bales, and Thomas had started early to beat the heat. By 10 a.m., he was halfway through the field. At 10:47, he stopped the tractor, shut off the baler, and climbed down. He sat in the grass beside the windrow, leaned back against the rear tire, and closed his eyes. He didn't get up. Carl Winters found him at 1:30 that afternoon, still sitting against the tire, his head tilted to one side. The baler was still attached to the tractor. The engine was off. There were 73 bales lined up in neat rows across the field. Thomas Carlyle was 69 years old. The medical examiner said it was a massive heart attack, said he'd probably been dead for 2 hours before anyone found him. The funeral was on a Saturday. Jacob came from Sioux Falls, Michael came from Rapid City, Paul came from Iowa, David came from Minnesota. All 4 of them stood beside their mother at the graveside service and listened to a pastor talk about hard work and faith and the dignity of a life spent on the land. None of them mentioned that their father had worked himself to death. After the service, they went back to the farmhouse and sat around the kitchen table and talked about what to do with the farm. Anne said she couldn't run it alone. Jacob said he couldn't move back. Michael said he'd help with the finances. Paul said he knew a guy who might be interested in leasing the ground. David didn't say anything. 2 months later, the cows were sold at auction. The equipment went the following spring. A family from Iowa leased the land for corn and soybeans, and Anne moved into a small house in Watertown. The New Holland 855 baler sold for $2,400. The man who bought it said it was still in good shape. There was a farmer named Glenn Hoffmeyer who'd been one of Thomas's first customers back in 1983. He'd been baling his own hay for 40 years, and when his back gave out, he'd hired Thomas, and Thomas had baled for him every year after that. Glenn had been at the funeral. He'd stood in the back, hadn't said much, and afterward, he'd walked over to Anne and told her that Thomas had been the most reliable man he'd ever worked with, that in 22 years Thomas had never missed a cutting, never left a field half done, never failed to show up when he said he would. Anne had thanked him. Glenn had nodded, and then he'd said, "He didn't have to work that hard, you know." Anne had looked at him and said, "Yes, he did." Glenn hadn't argued. Vernon Oakes, the dealer who'd sold Thomas the baler back in 1983, had retired in 1999. He'd moved to Arizona, and he hadn't heard about Thomas's death until a full year later when an old customer mentioned it in passing. Vernon had thought about that conversation in the equipment lot. He'd thought about the way Thomas had looked at the milking parlor, and then looked at the baler, and made a choice that Vernon had known, even then, was the wrong one. Not wrong because the baler didn't work. Wrong because it worked too well. Because it gave Thomas just enough to keep going, but not enough to stop. Because it turned the farm into something that required Thomas to destroy himself in order to save it. Vernon had wanted to call Anne and tell her he was sorry. He never did. He didn't know what he'd be apologizing for. In 2017, a man named Russell Kern bought 120 acres adjoining the old Carlisle place. He was young, 32, and he'd grown up in Sioux Falls and wanted to get into farming. He leased some ground, bought some equipment, and started putting up hay. One day, he was at an estate sale near Watertown, and he saw a round baler sitting in the back of a machine shed. It was old, dark blue, the paint chipped and faded. The meter read 127,000 bales. Russell asked the auctioneer about it. The auctioneer said it had belonged to a man named Thomas Carlyle. Said it had been sold once after Thomas died, and then sold again a few years later, and now it was here. Russell asked if it still ran. The auctioneer said he didn't know. Russell bought it for $800. He took it home, changed the oil, replaced the belts, greased the fittings, and fired it up. It started on the second try. He spent that summer baling his own hay and doing a little custom work on the side, and the baler never gave him any trouble. He didn't know Thomas Carlyle. He didn't know that the machine had once represented a choice between survival and modernization, between keeping a farm alive and letting it evolve. He just knew it worked. And 22 years after Thomas Carlyle died beside it, the New Holland 855 was still baling hay in the same county, on land that had once been part of the same rural fabric Thomas had tried so hard to preserve. The baler had outlasted the man. It had outlasted the dairy. It had outlasted the idea that hard work and stubbornness were enough. Ann Carlyle lived in Watertown until 2019, when she moved into an assisted living facility. She was 84 years old. Her sons visited when they could, and sometimes they talked about the farm, and sometimes they didn't. Once, Jacob asked her if she thought their father had made the right choice back in 1983. Ann had been quiet for a long time. Then she'd said, "He made the only choice he could live with." Jacob had asked if that was the same thing. Ann had said no. There's a story people tell about Thomas Carlyle, though not many people tell it anymore. They say he was the hardest working man in the county, that he never missed a job, never left a field unfinished, never let a customer down. They say he kept his farm going for 22 years after everyone said it couldn't be done, and that he did it with a single baler and a refusal to quit. They don't usually mention that he died doing it. They don't mention that the choice he made in 1983 bought him 2 decades of survival at the cost of everything else. They don't mention that his sons didn't farm, that his dairy closed, that the land he worked himself to death to keep eventually got leased out to strangers growing corn. They just say he worked hard. And in a place like South Dakota, in a community that values persistence and grit and the ability to endure, that's usually enough. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is moving through the fields and the sky is wide and empty, you have to ask whether hard work is the same thing as wisdom, whether survival is the same thing as success, whether a man who saves his farm by destroying himself has really saved anything at all. Thomas Carlyle bought a New Holland 855 round baler on June 14, 1983. It kept his farm alive. And 22 years later, it was still running when they found him beside it, leaning against the tire, his work finally done.